He had always been the type of person who believed in doing things differently. The world around him seemed to be moving at a fast pace, with people following trends and sticking to routines. But for him, the journey was about questioning those norms. It wasn't just about convenience or following the crowd. It was about making the world a little bit better, a little more sustainable, and that's why he had decided to install solar panels on his roof. It wasn't an easy decision. Solar panels weren't cheap, and the process of installation required a lot of planning. But for him, the benefits far outweighed the costs. The promise of free, clean energy from the sun was too good to pass up. He was tired of relying on the grid, tired of paying high electricity bills month after month. With solar panels, he could take control of his energy needs and reduce his carbon footprint. It was a move that made sense in so many ways. When the panels were finally installed, he felt a sense of pride. It was a personal victory, a way to stand against the traditional systems that seemed to disregard the environment in favor of profit. He knew it wasn't a solution to all the world's energy problems, but it was a step in the right direction. His house stood in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where lawns were neatly mowed and homes were decorated according to the latest trends. The people here valued tradition and order, and while that wasn't a problem in itself, he knew it sometimes led to resistance against anything that seemed out of place. Still, he didn't think much of it. His decision was practical, and he was confident that his neighbors would understand, even if they didn't share the same views. However, not long after the installation was completed, things started to change. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA. The letter, neatly printed on official letterhead, was polite but firm. It informed him that the HOA had received complaints about the solar panels on his roof. According to their guidelines, they weren't in line with the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. The letter stated that he had to remove them within 30 days or face penalties. At first, he was taken aback. He couldn't believe what he was reading. The HOA had never shown any interest in his personal decisions before. His house wasn't an eyesore. The solar panels were neatly installed, and they blended well with the design of the roof. In fact, he had taken care to ensure they were placed in a way that wasn't intrusive. He had even consulted with the installation company to ensure that everything was done according to the neighborhood's rules. He tried to make sense of it. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. Perhaps the HOA wasn't aware of the growing interest in renewable energy, or the fact that people were increasingly turning to solar power as a sustainable solution. But as he read the letter again, the words felt more like a personal attack. It wasn't just a matter of following rules. It was as if they were trying to erase his right to make a choice that aligned with his values. He decided to call the HOA. Maybe there had been a mistake, or perhaps a more reasonable solution could be found. He dialed the number listed on the letter and waited as the phone rang. When someone finally picked up, he explained the situation, trying to remain calm. He spoke about the benefits of solar power, how it helped reduce energy consumption and lower utility bills, and how it was an environmentally friendly choice. But the HOA representative didn't seem interested in hearing his side. The response was short and cold. They informed him that the rules were clear and that the panels didn't conform to the community's aesthetic standards. There was no room for discussion, no willingness to understand his point of view. The only option was to remove the panels. Frustration welled up inside him. It wasn't just about the solar panels. It was about the principle. The HOA, in its effort to maintain a certain image for the neighborhood, was disregarding his right to make decisions that were in the best interest of both himself and the environment. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was simply trying to do something positive, yet it seemed like the HOA didn't care. He thought about his options. The 30-day deadline loomed, and he knew he couldn't just give up. He had worked hard to get the panels installed, and the idea of removing them just because they didn't fit in with the neighborhood's image felt wrong. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He didn't want to back down, not when he knew that what he was doing was right. But the reality of the situation was starting to set in. The HOA had power. They had the ability to enforce their rules, and they had the support of the community behind them. Many of the neighbors likely didn't understand the importance of solar energy, and they probably didn't care about the environment the way he did. To them, it was just a matter of keeping the neighborhood looking neat and uniform. The idea that someone might challenge the status quo didn't sit well with them. In the days that followed, he began to notice the subtle signs of tension. His neighbors, who had once greeted him with friendly waves, now seemed to avoid eye contact. The local neighborhood chat group buzzed with discussions about non-conforming elements in the area. It didn't take long for him to realize that the HOA's influence extended far beyond just their rules. They had the power to sway the opinions of the entire community. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being treated like an outsider, someone who was disrupting the peace of the neighborhood simply by making a decision that didn't align with everyone else's. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. Why should he have to justify his actions when he knew he was doing something good? As the deadline to remove the panels drew nearer, he was faced with an increasingly difficult choice. Should he simply remove them and avoid further confrontation, or should he stand his ground and risk facing the consequences? The weight of the decision hung over him. He knew that giving in would feel like defeat, but defying the HOA could come with serious consequences. The pressure was mounting, and he felt cornered. He began to question whether it was worth fighting a system that seemed so entrenched, so unwilling to change. But deep down, he knew that backing down wasn't an option. He had to do something to show that his choice wasn't just about personal preference. It was about standing up for what was right. The tension continued to build, and the clock was ticking. He could feel the walls closing in. The HOA was set on removing his solar panels, and his neighbors had made it clear where they stood. But the more the pressure mounted, the more determined he became. He wouldn't let them take away something he had worked so hard to achieve. The stage was set for a showdown. The HOA had made their move, but he was far from ready to back down. He had always been someone who believed in doing things differently, and now it was time to prove just how far he was willing to go to protect what he believed in. The days after the letter arrived were filled with a sense of unease. Each morning he'd wake up to the reality that the HOA was determined to have his solar panels removed. He tried to go about his daily life, but the thought of having to take them down nagged at him constantly. It felt like a battle of principles, not just a matter of aesthetics or rules. He knew that the HOA wasn't just trying to maintain the neighborhood's appearance. They were trying to take away his ability to make a decision about how he powered his home. That, to him, felt like a bigger issue than just solar panels. One afternoon, he stood in his backyard looking up at the panels on the roof. They had become a symbol of something much larger than he had ever imagined. They weren't just energy sources anymore. They were a statement about his values, about his belief in sustainability and independence. The decision to install them had been an act of self-reliance. He wasn't going to let the HOA take that away. His phone rang, and it was a number he didn't recognize. It was the HOA office. His heart sank. He knew they were going to push harder now. He picked up the phone, preparing himself for the worst. "Hello, is this the homeowner with the solar panels?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've sent you several notices, and we're giving you one last chance to comply. If the panels aren't removed by the end of the month, we'll send a team to take them down ourselves. There will be a fine involved as well." The words felt like a punch to the gut. He had expected something like this, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more real. He tried to explain again, to make his case. He spoke about the environmental benefits, the long-term savings, the personal satisfaction of being energy independent. But the voice on the other end didn't seem to care about any of that. The HOA had made its decision, and they weren't going to back down. "I understand your position, but the rules are the rules," the representative said. "You have until the deadline. After that, we will proceed with the removal." The call ended, and he sat down on the couch feeling defeated. He had hoped for some understanding, some compromise, but the HOA wasn't interested in finding a middle ground. They weren't going to listen to his reasons or even acknowledge that his choice was a positive one for the environment. They simply wanted him to conform, to follow the rules without question. He knew the next step was going to be tough. He had spent hours researching the HOA's rules, looking for any loopholes, any reason he could argue against their decision. But the more he read, the more he realized that the HOA had everything covered. They had designed their guidelines to account for almost every situation, leaving very little room for exceptions. It was as if they had anticipated people like him, people who would try to do something different. He spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do next. He didn't want to back down, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the situation wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger than himself. It was about the right to make his own decisions and the right to challenge a system that seemed outdated and unwilling to change. One evening, as he sat on his porch, a neighbor approached him. It was a man who had lived in the neighborhood for years, someone he had spoken to only a few times before. The man looked uncomfortable, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "Hey, I just wanted to talk to you about the solar panels," he said cautiously. "I know the HOA is giving you a hard time about them." "I get it, I really do." He was surprised. It wasn't every day that a neighbor approached him like this, especially with the tension that had been building in the neighborhood. He'd noticed that people had started to avoid him, giving him strange looks when they passed by. But this man was different. He seemed sympathetic, even if he wasn't fully on board with the idea of solar energy. "I just wanted to say I don't really care about the panels," the neighbor continued. "If it were up to me, I'd leave them alone. But well, you know how it is with the HOA. They have a lot of influence around here." He nodded, understanding the unspoken pressure that came with living in a neighborhood where conformity was expected. It wasn't just about the HOA's rules. It was about the expectations of the community. People didn't want to cause trouble, and they certainly didn't want to be seen as troublemakers. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you," the neighbor added, "but if I were you, I'd just take them down. It's not worth the hassle. You don't want to get on the HOA's bad side. They're ruthless when it comes to enforcing the rules." The words stung more than he expected. He had hoped for support, or at least a word of encouragement, but it seemed like even his neighbor, who had acknowledged the problem, was advising him to give in. It was as if the whole neighborhood had accepted the HOA's authority without question, even if it meant sacrificing personal choice. But something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to give in. He had spent too much time, too much energy, fighting for something he believed in. He wasn't going to let the HOA or his neighbors force him into compliance. He wasn't going to back down from this fight, not now that he had come this far. He thanked the neighbor politely and watched him walk away, the weight of the conversation settling on his shoulders. It wasn't just the HOA that was putting pressure on him, it was the entire community. They all wanted him to conform, to fit in, to make life easier for everyone else, but he couldn't. He just couldn't. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He kept replaying the conversation in his mind, thinking about what he could do next. He couldn't let them take the panels down. He had to stand up for his right to make his own choices. But what could he do? The answer came to him slowly, like a spark of inspiration. He wasn't going to remove the panels, but he could make sure the HOA understood the consequences of their actions. He could show them what it felt like to have control taken away. He wasn't going to sit back and let them push him around anymore. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be legal, but at that moment, he didn't care. He had been pushed to the edge, and now he was ready to push back. The days leading up to the deadline felt like an eternity. Each passing moment seemed to increase the pressure on him. He tried to stick to his usual routine, but the weight of the situation was always on his mind. It wasn't just about the solar panels anymore, it was about something deeper. It was about standing up for what he believed in, even when everyone around him was telling him to back down. He was determined not to let the HOA win no matter what it took. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't just let them take his solar panels down. The HOA had overstepped their bounds, and he had to show them that their power didn't extend as far as they thought. He wasn't going to let them erase his right to make his own decisions. The question now was, what could he do to make his point? He spent hours researching the HOA's policies, trying to find any way to challenge their authority. But every legal path seemed blocked. The rules were clear, and the HOA had a strong grip on the community. They had made it clear that they were willing to go to extreme lengths to make sure their standards were upheld. But as much as he wanted to fight them through legal channels, he began to realize that it wasn't going to be enough. The HOA didn't care about the rules when it came to protecting their image, and they certainly weren't interested in hearing his reasons. That's when he started thinking differently. He realized that if he couldn't fight the HOA directly with rules or laws, he could fight them with disruption. He could show them the consequences of their actions in a way that would get their attention. He wasn't just going to remove the solar panels as they demanded. He was going to make them realize just how important his choice was. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. He knew it would have consequences, but he was at the point where he felt like he had no other choice. The HOA had made their move, and now it was time for him to make his. He wasn't going to let them continue to bully him and control his decisions. The idea came to him late one night, as he sat in his living room, staring at the solar panels outside his window. He could see them glinting in the moonlight, a reminder of the choice he had made. A choice that had become a symbol of his fight for independence and sustainability. The more he thought about it, the more the idea started to take shape. He could disrupt the entire neighborhood's power supply just for a short time, to show the HOA how vulnerable they were when they tried to control others' choices. It wasn't going to be easy. He had to figure out how to disconnect the power without causing any permanent damage, but he was resourceful and he had the skills to make it work. He had worked in tech for years, and while he wasn't an expert in electrical systems, he knew enough to get the job done. He spent the next few days gathering the tools and equipment he would need. It wasn't illegal to tamper with the power grid in his neighborhood, but it wasn't exactly legal either. He had to be careful, but he was prepared to take the risk. When the day of the deadline arrived, he felt a sense of anticipation. He had spent the last few days making sure everything was in place. The HOA had no idea what he was about to do. He was ready to send a message, and he was going to make sure they felt it. He had a feeling that what he was about to do would not only change the HOA's view of him, but also the entire neighborhood. He spent the morning going over his plan one last time. Everything had to be perfect. He couldn't afford any mistakes. He knew that even the smallest slip-up could ruin everything. The clock was ticking and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. At precisely 2 p.m., he made his move. He disconnected the power lines that supplied electricity to the neighborhood. The entire area went dark. It wasn't just his house that lost power, it was the whole block. The lights flickered and then everything went silent. There was no more hum of the refrigerator, no more sound of air conditioners running. For the first time in a long while, everything stopped. He sat back in his chair and took a deep breath. It was done. He had made his point. The power would stay out for a while, just long enough for the HOA to realize that their control over the neighborhood wasn't as absolute as they thought. He didn't plan on keeping the power out forever, just long enough to make them understand what it felt like when someone took control away from them. The phone calls started coming in almost immediately. At first, it was just the neighbors calling to ask if he knew what had happened. They were confused, frustrated, and even a little scared. People were used to having their power on at all times. When it went out unexpectedly, it sent a wave of unease through the neighborhood. Then came the HOA. The calls from their office were frantic, demanding to know what had caused the outage. He didn't answer right away, allowing the situation to unfold before him. He wasn't going to make it easy for them to sweep this under the rug. By the time the HOA representatives showed up at his doorstep, he knew they were angry. They had no idea how to fix the problem, because they had no idea how it had happened. They weren't prepared for someone to stand up to them this way. They had expected him to back down, to be intimidated by their threats, but he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. "We need you to turn the power back on immediately," one of the HOA representatives demanded when he answered the door. He stared at them for a moment, taking in their stern faces. He could tell that they were frustrated and bewildered, unsure of how to handle the situation. It was clear that they hadn't expected this kind of resistance. "I'll turn the power back on," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But first I need you to understand something. I'm not just some homeowner you can push around. I have the right to make decisions about my property. These solar panels are staying up. If you want them down, you're going to have to do more than just threaten me. You need to show me that you're willing to respect my rights." The representative's face turned red with anger, but he didn't back down. He knew that this was his moment. The HOA could either choose to back off, or they could escalate things, but he wasn't going to be intimidated anymore. The power was restored after a tense negotiation, but the message had been sent. The HOA had learned that he wasn't someone to be pushed around. He had taken control of the situation in a way they hadn't anticipated, and for the first time they realized that their rules didn't have the power they once thought they did. The homeowner had stood his ground. and he had made sure the entire neighborhood knew it. As the lights flickered back on, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He had taken a stand, and he had made it clear that he wasn't going to let anyone dictate his choices. The HOA might have had the power to enforce their rules, but they had just learned a valuable lesson. There were consequences to pushing people too far. The power had been restored, but the sense of tension in the neighborhood hadn't faded. In fact, it only seemed to grow. People were still talking about the blackout, and many were trying to figure out what had happened. It wasn't the sort of thing that could easily be explained away. The sudden loss of power, the quiet tension that followed, it had everyone on edge. He knew that things weren't going to be the same after this. The HOA wasn't going to let it slide, and neither were his neighbors. He had made a bold move, but now he had to face the consequences. The next morning, as he stepped outside, he was greeted by the familiar sight of the HOA representatives standing at his doorstep again. This time, they weren't just a couple of people in suits. There was an air of urgency in their movements. They had brought backup, people who looked even more official than before. It was clear that they weren't messing around anymore. "We need to talk," one of them said, a stern look on their face. He stood there for a moment, taking in the situation. There were a few neighbors in the background, watching from their windows or porches, clearly curious about what was going on. They had been quiet the day before, but now that the power had been restored, they were starting to come out of their homes, sensing that something big was happening. The representative spoke again, his voice sharp. "You've caused a lot of disruption, and we need to resolve this immediately. You've already ignored our requests, and now you've gone too far. We can't allow this to continue." He wasn't surprised by the aggression in their tone. He knew they were angry. He had crossed a line, and they were going to make sure he understood that. But this time he wasn't going to back down. He had already made his point with the power outage. He had shown them that their rules weren't as absolute as they thought. Now it was time for the next step. "I didn't cause this disruption," he said calmly, trying to maintain his composure. "You did. You started this by demanding I remove my solar panels. You didn't give me a choice. I'm standing up for my rights, and I'm not going to be bullied into submission." The HOA representative's face grew redder. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. He was used to getting his way, to having people back down when the HOA made a demand. But this time it wasn't going to happen. The power had shifted, and he could feel it. "We gave you an opportunity to comply," the representative spat, his voice rising. "You didn't have to go this far. This is a violation of community standards, and you'll be held accountable for it. If you don't remove the panels by the end of the week, we will take further action. You'll be fined, and we'll pursue legal action if necessary." He listened carefully, but the words didn't have the same weight they once had. He had heard threats from the HOA before, and he had learned not to be intimidated. The more they spoke, the more he realized that they didn't have the power they thought they did. They had no real understanding of what he was willing to do to stand up for himself. "Go ahead," he said, his tone steady. "Take legal action. I'm not going to remove the panels. You're the ones violating my rights, not the other way around." The HOA representatives exchanged looks, clearly taken aback by his defiance. They had expected him to back down, to apologize and agree to their demands. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. The tension in the air was thick. Neighbors had gathered in small groups, watching from their windows or standing on their porches, trying to get a glimpse of what was happening. It was clear that everyone was curious, but no one was willing to step forward. They had seen what had happened the day before, and now they were watching to see how far he was willing to go. "I'm not going to be intimidated anymore," he said, his voice stronger now. "I did what I had to do, and I'll do it again if I have to. You can't control me, and you can't control my choices." The HOA representative stood there, staring at him for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They had never encountered someone like him before. People usually complied with their demands. They were used to getting what they wanted without much resistance. But now they were facing someone who wasn't afraid to fight back, and that was something they weren't prepared for. After a long pause, the representatives finally turned to leave. They didn't have any immediate answers, but it was clear that they weren't done with him yet. They would be back. The battle wasn't over, but as they walked away, he felt a sense of victory. He had stood his ground, and for the first time he felt like he had won. That night he couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. He had expected this to be a simple issue, something he could handle quietly. but it had grown into something much bigger. The fight for his solar panels had turned into a battle for his right to make his own decisions. And he had learned something important along the way. Sometimes standing up for what you believe in means taking risks and facing down people who are used to getting their way. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. As the days went by, the neighborhood's mood began to shift. People were starting to talk about what had happened. Some were on his side, others were not. But what was clear was that the HOA's power was no longer as unquestioned as it once had been. His actions had forced people to see the situation from a different perspective. The neighbors who had once avoided him now began to approach him with questions, some even offering support. The community was divided, but it was a division that had sparked a conversation about personal rights, about the limits of authority, and about the future of energy independence. He knew that he had only scratched the surface of what could be a much larger change. The HOA would likely continue to push, but he was ready. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone in the neighborhood who had ever been told to follow the rules without question. It was about challenging the systems that tried to control people's choices. And it was about creating a space where people could make their own decisions, free from the fear of retribution. As he looked out over his backyard that evening, watching the sunset reflect off the panels, he knew that he had taken the first step toward something bigger. The journey wasn't over, but he had already proven that standing up for what's right was worth the fight. The days after his confrontation with the HOA representatives were tense. He could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him as he went about his daily life. People were curious, some sympathetic, others skeptical. But there was one thing that was clear. The atmosphere in the community had changed. The HOA had always been the silent authority in the neighborhood, a presence that everyone respected or feared. But now things felt different. People were talking, and for the first time there seemed to be a crack in the HOA's control. The HOA hadn't given up. They were persistent, coming back again and again with threats of legal action, fines, and continued pressure to remove his solar panels. But every time they came, he stood firm. He wasn't going to give in. He had already fought once, and he wasn't about to lose now. The battle wasn't over, and he wasn't about to let them think they had won. His neighbors were starting to notice the struggle. Some had reached out, offering their support, while others whispered about the situation behind his back. But he wasn't bothered by the gossip. This wasn't about winning the approval of everyone around him. This was about something much bigger, his right to make decisions for his home and his life. The HOA's tactics became more aggressive. They sent letters demanding compliance, threatening to impose fines, and even warning of the possibility of a lawsuit. But each time he received a letter, he simply ignored it. He wasn't going to let them dictate his choices any longer. The more they pushed, the more determined he became to fight for what he believed in. One day, a new twist in the story unfolded. He received a call from his lawyer, someone he had consulted briefly when the HOA first started their campaign against him. His lawyer, a calm and collected professional, explained that the HOA had filed a formal lawsuit against him, seeking to have his solar panels removed by force. The legal papers were clear. The HOA was taking him to court. He wasn't surprised. He had expected this to happen eventually, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. He knew the stakes were higher now. If he lost, he would not only have to remove the panels, but he would likely face significant legal fees and penalties. It was a battle that could cost him more than just the panels on his roof. The lawyer suggested negotiating a settlement, something to avoid a long and costly legal battle. But he wasn't interested in settling. This wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about the principle of it all. He wasn't going to let the HOA decide what he could or couldn't do with his property. He wanted to fight. As the date for the court hearing drew closer, he felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He wasn't afraid of the courtroom. In fact, he had always been someone who believed in standing up for what was right, even if it meant going against the odds. But there was a part of him that wondered what it would cost him. Would he lose everything? Would the community turn against him? He had made his decision, but the consequences were still unknown. The night before the hearing, he sat in his living room, staring at the solar panels on his roof. They looked different now, not just as a source of energy, but as a symbol of his fight. They represented more than just a decision to save money on his electricity bill. They were a stand for his right to choose, for the right of every homeowner to make decisions for their own property without interference. The courtroom was packed the next morning. The HOA had brought a team of lawyers and they had made sure to get the word out. It was a case that had stirred up a lot of interest in the community, and now everyone was watching. He could see the faces of his neighbors in the crowd, some looking concerned, others curious. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the neighborhood, the HOA's power, and the right of homeowners to have a say in how their homes were run. The judge, a stern and impartial figure, called the case to order. The HOA's lawyers began presenting their argument, claiming that the solar panels violated the community's aesthetic guidelines and were a distraction to the neighborhood's uniform appearance. They cited various clauses in the HOA's rules that stated all exterior changes to homes had to be approved in advance. They even brought in testimony from some neighbors who claimed the panels were an eyesore and disrupted the harmony of the community. His lawyer responded, calmly and methodically, pointing out that the solar panels were legal, that they had been installed with proper permits, and that the HOA had no right to enforce rules that were outdated and no longer relevant in today's world. His lawyer emphasized the environmental benefits of the panels, the reduction in energy consumption, and the fact that the HOA had never previously raised concerns about the appearance of other home improvements, such as fences, paint jobs, or landscaping. The argument grew heated as the HOA's lawyers tried to paint him as someone who was unwilling to follow the rules, someone who didn't care about the community, but he wasn't going to let that narrative stand. When the time came for him to speak, he stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He spoke clearly and confidently, explaining why he had made the decision to install the solar panels in the first place. He talked about his desire to be more self-sufficient, to reduce his environmental impact, and to save money on his energy bills. He explained that his decision wasn't about breaking the rules, it was about making a choice that was best for him and for the planet. And most importantly, he pointed out that the HOA's power shouldn't extend into personal decisions like this. I didn't install these panels to upset anyone, he said, looking directly at the judge. I did it because it was the right thing to do for me and for my family. And I believe I have the right to make that choice without being bullied into removing something that is important to me. His words hung in the air for a moment, and for the first time he saw a shift in the room. The judge looked thoughtful, and even the HOA's lawyers seemed momentarily taken aback. There was a quiet pause before the judge called for a recess, and everyone filed out of the courtroom. During the break, he stood in the hallway, trying to steady his nerves. The outcome of this case was still uncertain, but he had said what needed to be said. He had stood up for himself, for his rights, and for the principle that homeowners should have the freedom to make decisions about their own property. When the hearing resumed, the judge delivered his verdict. The decision was clear. The HOA had overstepped its bounds and the homeowner had the right to keep the solar panels. The judge ruled that the HOA's rules were outdated and that they could not force the removal of the panels. The courtroom erupted into whispers and murmurs as the judge's ruling sank in. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of relief. The battle was over and he had won. He hadn't just won the right to keep his solar panels. He had won the right to make decisions for his own life, without being controlled by an outdated set of rules. The HOA's lawyers were stunned. They had expected to win, to force him into submission, but they had underestimated his determination. As he walked out of the courtroom, he felt a surge of pride. He had fought for what was right and he had come out victorious. His neighbors began to approach him, offering congratulations and support. Some of them even admitted that they had been wrong to side with the HOA. It was a moment of realization for many of them. What had started as a personal struggle had turned into something bigger. It was about more than just solar panels. It was about standing up for personal rights and the freedom to make choices without fear of retribution. As he stood in the parking lot, looking up at his house and the solar panels on the roof, he knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The community would continue to change and the HOA would have to reconsider its tactics. But for now, he had won, and he had proven that standing up for what you believe in was always worth the fight. The dust had finally settled after the court ruling. The neighborhood was still buzzing with energy, but now it was a different kind of energy. The HOA, having been forced to accept defeat, had grown quieter. For the first time, they were uncertain, unsure of how to handle a homeowner who refused to back down. His victory hadn't just been a personal win. It had changed the way many people in the community viewed authority and rules. In the days following the court decision, he noticed a shift in the dynamics around him. People were more open, more willing to engage. The tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud for so long had dissipated, replaced by an unspoken understanding. It wasn't just about the solar panels anymore. The real victory was the shift in mindset, the realization that sometimes standing up for what was right meant challenging the status quo. He continued to live in the same house, the one he had fought so hard to protect. The solar panels were still on the roof, gleaming in the sunlight, a constant reminder of the battle he had won. But there was something else, something deeper that had changed in him. He no longer felt the need to apologize for his choices or try to justify them to anyone. He had taken control of his life in a way he had never done before, and it felt empowering. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now came to talk to him, many of them with a new sense of respect. Some of them, who had originally sided with the HOA, admitted that they had misunderstood the situation. They confessed that they hadn't realized how important it was for him to make this decision, to take a stand for something he believed in. These conversations were awkward at first, but they opened up a space for growth. The dialogue between him and his neighbors had shifted from passive observation to genuine connection. One afternoon, while he was working in the garden, a neighbor he hadn't spoken to much came by. The man, an older gentleman with a weathered face and kind eyes, approached slowly. "I just wanted to say," he started, hesitating for a moment, "that I didn't really understand your fight before. I thought you were just being difficult, but now I see that you were doing something important. I wanted to apologize for not seeing it sooner." The man's words were simple, but they meant more than he could express. He nodded, grateful for the gesture. "I appreciate that," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. It wasn't easy, but sometimes doing the right thing isn't about making everyone happy. It's about staying true to yourself. The older man smiled and nodded. "You're right. I don't know if I could have done what you did, but I admire it." The conversation wasn't groundbreaking, but it was one of many small moments that helped him realize how powerful his decision had been. It wasn't just about one person taking a stand. It was about the way his actions had sparked a conversation. People were talking, thinking, and reevaluating their own beliefs and actions. And for the first time, it felt like they were doing so with a sense of openness rather than judgment. As the weeks passed, the HOA seemed to withdraw. They had lost the court case, and there was little they could do now to force him to comply. They didn't make any more direct attempts to intervene in his life, though he knew they were watching from a distance. In some ways, their silence spoke louder than their threats ever had. But even with the HOA out of the picture, there were still challenges to face. He began to notice small things, comments from neighbors about his decision, murmurs in the community that hinted at lingering doubt. Some people couldn't understand why he had fought so hard for something like solar panels. To them, it was just an inconvenience, a disruption to the way things had always been. They couldn't see beyond the immediate discomfort, the change in the status quo, but he wasn't bothered by these whispers. His resolve was stronger than ever. He had made a difference, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as he was sitting on his porch watching the sun set over the neighborhood, a thought crossed his mind. He had fought for his right to make his own decisions, but what about everyone else? What about his neighbors who felt trapped by the rules, afraid to speak up because they feared the consequences of defying the HOA? He realized that his victory wasn't just about him. It could be about all of them. He began to think about how he could help others in the neighborhood who might be in similar situations, who might be facing pressure from the HOA or other forces in the community. What if there was a way to create a space where people could share their experiences, talk about the challenges they faced, and find strength in knowing they weren't alone? What if they could stand together and change things, not just for themselves but for the entire community? It was a big idea, one that would require more than just his effort. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had a responsibility now. He had opened a door and it was time to walk through it. The neighborhood was at a crossroads, and he knew that the choices made in the coming months could shape the community for years to come. The next day, He called a few of his neighbors, those he had connected with during the struggle, and asked if they would be interested in coming together to discuss ways they could work together to make the neighborhood a better place. He knew that it wouldn't be easy. The HOA had a strong hold on many people, and not everyone would be willing to step outside of their comfort zone. But he also knew that change couldn't happen without people being willing to take risks. The first meeting was small. Just a few people gathered around his dining table, drinking coffee and talking about the things that bothered them. It wasn't a protest, it wasn't an argument, it was simply a conversation. And it was the beginning of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. As they talked, he could sense the shift in the room. People were beginning to see that they weren't powerless. They had a voice, and together, they could make a difference. It was the start of a community movement, one that would grow over time. People who had once been afraid to speak out found strength in numbers. They began to share their concerns about the HOA's overreach, the rules that seemed outdated and stifling, and the ways in which they felt disconnected from the decisions being made in their own neighborhood. The more they talked, the more they realized that they weren't alone. They weren't just fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting for a community that respected the rights of every individual. The change wasn't immediate. It wasn't a dramatic shift overnight, but over time the conversations continued. The HOA, once an untouchable force in the neighborhood, began to face more scrutiny. People started to question their authority, their rules, and their impact on the community. They began to demand more transparency, more fairness, and more respect for personal choices. It was a slow, steady process, but it was happening. And all the while, the solar panels on his roof remained, a testament to the power of standing up for what you believe in. They were no longer just a personal victory. They were a symbol of change, a reminder that sometimes one person's actions could spark a ripple effect that transformed an entire community. As he sat on his porch, looking at the panels one last time before the sun dipped below the horizon, he realized something. He had started this journey not for fame, not for recognition, but simply because he believed in doing what was right. And in the end, that was all that mattered. He had made a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone around him.